32 containers arrived in Iran after 15 days on land. That is where I want to begin, because that is the moment that matters, not a summit, not a memorandum, not another Belt and Road slogan. A train leaving China, crossing deserts and mountains, moving through 4 other countries, and reaching Iran without touching the sea at all. That is not just logistics, that is a signal, and the reason it matters is simple. For years, the strongest American weapon against countries like Iran was not only military force, it was control over the map itself, the sea lanes, the ports, the insurers, the banks, the currency, the entire architecture that turns trade into leverage. If Washington wanted to squeeze a sanctioned state, it did not need to fire a shot. It could turn distance, finance, and route dependence into a slow strangulation system. That was the real power. And the train is a problem for that system. The real story is not that China quietly built a 10,400 kilometer railway to Iran. The real story is that one train just proved the old map is no longer absolute. That is the line that matters. Not that American sea power suddenly means nothing. Not that sanctions have collapsed. Not that rail can replace the ocean. None of that is true. The deeper truth is sharper than that. A choke point begins to lose part of its power the moment someone shows it can be bypassed. That is what happened here. To understand why, you have to leave Iran and look east toward the place Chinese planners have feared for years. The Strait of Malacca, for most people, it is just another name on a map for Beijing. It is a pressure point under the skin. Roughly 80% of China's imported oil passes through that corridor. That means the industrial heart of China, the factories, transport, and energy system that keep the world's second largest economy alive depends on one narrow maritime passage staying open. Think about the strategic terror inside that fact. If your economy breathes through one corridor, then whoever can threaten that corridor already has a hand near your throat. Maybe not enough to close it permanently, maybe not without cost, but enough to make you plan your future around the possibility that it could be squeezed. That is the Malacca problem. And once China accepted that problem as real, the logic that followed was unavoidable. It did not just need bigger ports or more tankers, it needed escape routes. It needed ways of moving vital goods that did not rely entirely on oceans shaped by someone else's naval dominance. It needed corridors that sanctions, patrols, port pressure, and financial coercion could not control in the same old way. That is why this railway matters so much. It is not mainly a transportation story. It is an escape story. China looked at a global order in which the sea carried trade, the dollar settled trade, and the West shaped both systems more than anyone else. Then it started building something else. Not a replacement yet, but a route outside the old trap. The line from Western China through Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and into Iran is an engineering answer to a strategic fear. On paper, it sounds simple enough. In reality, it meant solving brutal terrain, border friction, customs mismatches, and the fact that the rail gauges across the route were never designed to work as one seamless commercial corridor. Cargo had to keep moving across incompatible systems. Specialized bogie exchange stations had to be built. Critical points had to be hardened. Parts of the Iranian side were even placed underground, not because it looked elegant, but because the route had to survive more than weather. That detail tells you everything. This was not built for convenience. It was built for pressure, and that changes how you should read it. A lot of coverage still treats this project like another grand Chinese infrastructure flourish. It is not, or at least not mainly. This is strategic redundancy in steel. A route that says to Beijing and Tehran, if the sea grows dangerous, there is still another path, maybe smaller, maybe slower in total carrying capacity, but real enough to matter, hard enough to choke, and politically important enough to change calculations. That is what makes the corridor more important than its cargo volume. It changes the psychology of coercion. That is the first big point. The second is money, because moving goods is only half the story. The other half is settling value. China has been buying Iranian oil in yuan for years. That matters because sanctions are not just about shipping. They are about clearing and paying. The dollar system is one of the deepest pillars of American global influence. Energy priced and settled in dollars reinforces the system. Energy settled outside of it begins to chip at that system quietly. One transaction at a time, the rail corridor and the yuan channel reinforce each other. One moves the goods, the other moves the payment. Together, they form something much larger than a train line. They form a parallel channel around the older architecture of Western pressure. That phrase matters. Parallel channel, the West built in order around maritime dominance, major banks, insurer networks, and dollar settlement. China is not replacing that order outright, but it is building routes that reduce dependence on it. A freight corridor here, a yuan energy relationship there, a long-term supply deal, a dry port policy, bank financing, Central Asian rail integration. None of those things by themselves overturn the old system. Power never shifts that cleanly. But once enough exceptions become habits, the exceptions stop looking exceptional. That is the deeper significance of this railway. It normalizes bypass. Iran is central to that logic for obvious reasons. It is sanctioned, it borders Hormuz, it sits at the hinge between Central Asia and the Gulf. It sells the oil China wants, and it is isolated enough to say yes to structures the old order would rather not see come alive. China does not need to love Iran for any of this to matter. Iran is useful. That is enough. The 25-year, $400 billion. China. Iran agreement was the political skeleton. This road is part of the physical skeleton. And from Tehran's point of view, the attraction is clear. A country that has spent years being told trade with it would be punished, now has a major buyer, a non-dollar settlement system, and an overland route that does not need to ask permission from the ocean, that does not end sanctions. But it changes what sanctions feel like. Instead of total isolation, you get managed breathing room. Instead of one global system closing in from every side, you get a second system, smaller and rougher, but still real, through which enough value can keep moving to keep the state alive. That is where this story becomes bigger than Iran, because smaller countries watch these things closely. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, states whose futures have long been narrowed by geography, look at a functioning corridor through Iran and see something dangerous from Washington's perspective. Choice. Once a state has real trade alternatives, it thinks differently, it bargains differently, it borrows differently, it starts imagining that Western preference is not fate, only one option. That is how routes become influenced, not with speeches, with habits. The five-nation corridor plan now taking shape matters for that reason. It is not just an expansion of track, it is an expansion of orientation. And in parallel, China and Russia are pushing the Arctic route as another answer to the same strategic problem. One route over land, another through the frozen north, different geography, same civilizational logic, reduce exposure to the choke points and systems the West has historically shaped best. Now, discipline matters here. This is not a miracle. Rail cannot replace maritime volume. A supertanker still dwarfs a train. Borders still create friction. Fixed corridors can be targeted. Maintenance is punishing. Even the source document admits the service appeared to stall after strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure. This line is not invulnerable, not dominant, and not enough by itself to redraw global trade. But that is still the wrong standard. The corridor does not need to replace the sea to matter. It only needs to weaken monopoly, because monopoly power starts weakening before replacement arrives. The moment a credible alternative exists, the old system stops being final, maybe not weak, but no longer unquestioned. That is why one train matters so much more than its cargo count suggests. It demonstrates possibility, and possibility in geopolitics is radioactive. Once other states begin believing that trade can move outside the old routes, that value can settle outside the old currency channels, and that sanctioned states can still function if Beijing decides to keep the oxygen flowing. The old coercive map starts losing part of its psychological authority. That is what should worry Washington. Not the containers themselves, the precedent they create, because the precedent says the world America learned to pressure may no longer be the only world available. It says that sanctions can still hurt, but not close the fist as completely. If enough alternative infrastructure exists, it says naval dominance still matters, but less absolutely. If trade can be redirected through land corridors no navy can patrol, it says smaller states may slowly begin to think of Western controlled systems not as inevitabilities, but as one architecture among several. That is the real story. Not that China sent a train to Iran, China just demonstrated in steel and distance that the old map is no longer sacred. And once a map stops looking sacred, countries start drawing new ones.